Welcome to Pomoja Podcast, a ministry of Life of Christ International Ministries. Pomoja means together, and that's exactly what this space is about. Growing together, learning together, walking together, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Barry Mwamba, and during this first conversation, I'd like us to explore one of God's greatest gifts to humanity, marriage. Not simply as a relationship between a man and a woman, but as a covenant established by God, designed to reflect his heart, and one of the greatest testimonies the world will ever witness. At the same time, it has become one of life's greatest challenges, and I don't think that's a coincidence. Have you ever stopped and wondered why? Why has marriage become such a battlefield? Why do so many couples begin with hope, only to find themselves struggling a few years later? Why are families under so much pressure? Why are husbands and wives constantly being pulled in different directions? I don't believe the enemy wastes his energy. Throughout the Bible, he consistently attacks what heaven values most. He attacked the promised seed. He attacked worship. He attacked God's people. He attacked the prophets. He even tried to destroy the Messiah himself. So why should we be surprised that he also attacks marriage? Because marriage is much more than two people living under the same roof. It is God's design. It is God's testimony. It is one of the clearest pictures of Christ and his church. And when a Christian marriage reflects God's heart, it preaches a sermon long before anyone opens a Bible. Maybe that's why the enemy fears it so much. This season is an invitation to walk together through a house, not just any house, a house in the middle of a forest. Over the next several conversations, we'll discover its foundation. We'll look through its windows. We'll walk through its rooms. We'll stand together when storms come. And by the end of this journey, my prayer is that you'll never look at marriage the same way again. Today's conversation is where it all begins, not with a wedding, not with the ceremony, not even with my marriage. It begins with a story. Actually, it begins with my father. When I was preparing to get married, I thought I knew what I needed. Like most young men, I expected advice. I thought my father would talk to me about responsibility, about communication, about finances, maybe about being a good husband, maybe about leading a family, the kind of conversation every son expects before marriage. Instead, he told me a story. At the time, I'll be honest with you, I didn't fully understand it. I listened. I appreciated it, but I didn't realize what he had just placed in my heart. Some lessons are explained, others are planted, and just like seeds, they stay hidden for years until life begins to water them. Looking back today, almost 20 years later, I realized my father wasn't simply giving me advice. He was giving me a way to see marriage. Sometimes, God uses stories because stories stay with us longer than instructions. In fact, that's exactly what Jesus often did. When people expected an explanation, he gave them a parable. Not because he wanted to make things more complicated, but because stories have a way of reaching places that information never can. I didn't know it then, but my father's story would become one of those stories, one that would quietly grow inside me, year after year, until one day, I finally understood what he meant. And that's the story I'd like to share with you today. Because I believe if it changed the way I see marriage, It just might change the way you see it too. Let's begin. So, there I was, a young man, deeply in love, certain that I had found the woman I wanted to spend the rest of my life with. Like every young man preparing for marriage, I knew there was one conversation I needed to have. The conversation with my father. I wanted his blessing. But more than that, I wanted his wisdom. Because no matter how much you think you know, there are people who have already walked the road you're about to travel. And if you're wise, you'll listen before you begin your journey. Looking back today, I realized something. One of the greatest gifts God gives us is the wisdom of those who walked before us. The Bible says, stand at the crossroads and look. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is and walk in it. I think we've lost something in our generation. We celebrate innovation and sometimes forget the value of wisdom. We admire what is new, but overlook those who have already lived what we're trying to build. My father had already lived through seasons I had never experienced. He had already faced storms I couldn't yet imagine. He had already learned lessons that I hadn't even discovered I needed. And because of that, I chose to listen. Can I encourage you with something? Never underestimate the value of godly counsel, especially when you're making decisions that will shape the rest of your life. A career, a ministry, a friendship, a marriage. Some decisions are simply too important to make alone. The book of Proverbs repeats this truth again and again. There is wisdom in a multitude of counselors. Not just any counselors, godly counselors. People who love God more than they love being right. People who care more about your future than your feelings. People willing to tell you the truth, even when it isn't what you hope to hear. I thank God that my father was one of those people. So, I sat down with him, expecting what every son expects. Advice, practical wisdom, maybe a checklist, maybe instructions about being a husband, maybe lessons about finances, leadership, communication, responsibility. Honestly, I don't remember expecting anything extraordinary, just a conversation between a father and his son. But instead, he smiled, looked at me, and began telling me a story. No instructions, no lecture, just a story. I remember listening, trying to understand where he was going. And if I'm honest, I wasn't sure. You know how parents sometimes tell stories, and halfway through, you're wondering, where is this going? That was me. I had no idea that nearly 20 years later, I would still be talking about that story. Sometimes, God hides life's greatest lessons inside the simplest conversations. That's why Jesus spoke in parables, because information fills the mind, but stories find their way into the heart. And once a story reaches the heart, it stays there. Looking back now, I realize my father wasn't trying to answer my questions. He was changing the way I would see marriage. There's a difference. Advice tells you what to do. Vision changes how you see. And once the way you see changes, the way you live begins to change as well. That conversation planted a seed I didn't fully understand at the time. It remained buried, quietly growing, through the joys, through the misunderstandings, through the victories, through the difficult seasons, until one day, I looked back and realized my father had been right all along. And today, I'd like to invite you into that same conversation, because I believe if you can see what my father wanted me to see, you'll never look at marriage the same way again. So, This is what he said. My father looked at me, smiled, and simply said, "My son, let me tell you a story." He said, "Imagine a man, not just any man, a man who has decided to build a house, but not in the city, not where people pass by every day, not where neighbors are only a few steps away. Instead, he chooses a place deep inside a forest, far away from everything, a place where the only sounds you hear are the wind moving through the trees, the birds greeting the morning, and the quietness that only nature can give. Imagine walking through that forest. The deeper you go, the quieter it becomes. The noise of the world slowly disappears. No traffic, no crowds, no distractions, just trees, one after another. Then, after what feels like a long walk, you finally see it. A beautiful house, standing alone, peaceful, warm, almost unexpected. You wonder, who lives here? Why would anyone build a house so far away from everyone else? As you get closer, you notice something unusual. The windows don't open. The door only opens from the outside. And yet, inside the house, everything is warm, comfortable, peaceful, safe. My father stopped talking. He looked at me, as if waiting for me to understand. I didn't, not really. So he continued. He said, "My son, marriage is like that house." I'll never forget those words. At the time, they sounded beautiful, but I didn't understand them. Not yet. Maybe you've had moments like that. Someone says something to you, and you know it's important, but you don't yet know why. You write it down. You remember it. You carry it. And then, years later, life explains what words could not. That's exactly what happened to me. For years, that story stayed quietly in my heart. Then marriage began teaching me what my father had already tried to show me. Today, I understand why he didn't give me a list of rules, because rules can be forgotten. But a picture stays with you. Can I tell you something I've discovered? God often teaches through pictures. When Jesus wanted to explain faith, he spoke about seeds. When he wanted to explain the kingdom, he spoke about vineyards, shepherds, sheep, fishermen, wedding feasts. Why? Because pictures remain in our hearts long after explanations fade. My father gave me a picture, a house, standing quietly in the middle of a forest. And every time life tested our marriage, I found myself returning to that house. The older I became, the more I understood. The story wasn't really about a house, it was about covenant. It was about protecting something precious. It was about understanding that what God builds must also be guarded, because every beautiful home will eventually face weather. Every marriage will experience seasons. Some days will feel like spring, others like winter. Some days, the fire inside the house burns brightly. Other days, someone has to gather more wood. That's marriage, not perfection. Faithfulness, not the absence of storms, but the decision to remain inside the covenant while the storm passes. And perhaps that's the first lesson my father wanted me to learn. Marriage isn't built because life will be easy. Marriage is built because covenant gives two people a place to stand when life becomes difficult. That little house, hidden in the middle of the forest, has stayed with me for nearly 20 years. And today, I'd like to take you inside it, because every part of that house has something to teach us. And I believe, before this conversation is over, you'll begin to recognize your own house. As we come to the end of our first conversation, I hope you've begun to see marriage a little differently, not simply as two people who love each other, but as a covenant designed by God, a house carefully built, carefully protected, and filled with purpose. Today, I haven't tried to explain every detail of my father's story. In fact, we've only walked through the forest. We've only arrived at the front door. And perhaps that's exactly where we need to stop. Because before you can understand the house, you first have to see it. Before you can appreciate its beauty, you have to recognize its value. I hope that over the next few days, you'll think about that house. Think about your own marriage, or the marriage you're praying God will one day give you. Ask yourself, what kind of house am I building? Because every house begins long before the first brick is laid. It begins with a vision. It begins with a decision. And ultimately, it begins with God. Thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. It is truly an honor to walk this journey together. In our next conversation, I'd like to tell you something I couldn't have told you today. Because today, I've shared my father's story. Next time, I'll share mine. Nearly 20 years have passed since my father first told me about that house in the middle of the forest. At the time, I heard his words, but I didn't fully understand them. Life has a way of teaching us what words alone never can. Over the years, our marriage has experienced seasons of joy, moments of uncertainty, times of growth, and lessons that only time can teach. Looking back today, I finally understand what my father was trying to show me, and I'd like to share those discoveries with you. Because sometimes, the greatest wisdom isn't understood in a single conversation. Sometimes, it takes years. So, if today's conversation introduced you to the house, our next conversation will reveal what 20 years of living in that house has taught me. Until then, take a moment this week to think about your own house, whether you're married, preparing for marriage, or praying that one day God will lead you into one. Remember this: every strong marriage begins long before the wedding day. It begins with God. Thank you for spending this time with me. It has truly been a privilege to walk with you through this first conversation. Until next time, may God bless you, strengthen your faith, and continue building stronger lives, deeper faith, and Christ-centered homes together.